Hello. I am really sorry that I can't be with you tonight. Things started to pile up. Leon Panetta is being welcomed into the California Hall of Fame as you are watching this. And so I will be sitting with him and his family for that induction. So I apologize for not being able to be with you in person. But I'm going to do the next best thing, which is I was asked to talk about two things. The state budget and also Proposition 1. And I'm going to start with Proposition 1 because normally when every fall in an election year runs around, I do a workshop on all the California propositions, and this is the only one on the ballot. And so I'm going to talk about it here in the same format that I would normally if I were presenting, which is to tell you a little about the proposition, to tell you roughly what the cost is, who supports and opposes it, who has raised money in what way, so how much has been spent or raised on each side, and then are there any newspapers that have taken a position on the proposition. So Proposition 1 is the only statewide proposition on the ballot. It is a bond measure, and it was put on by the state legislature with strong support by the governor. And it addresses residential facilities for mental health and alcohol and drug abuse patients. The measure would fund $6.4 billion in a bond to drastically expand the state's mental health and substance abuse treatment infrastructure. A majority of the money, $4.4 billion, would be used to build 10,000 inpatient and residential treatment beds across the state. The remainder would fund permanent supportive housing, with half set aside for veterans with mental illness or addiction disorders. The second part of the measure would require counties to change the way they spend existing mental health fund by directing them to prioritize housing for people who are chronically homeless. So in the first part, it really provides beds. And 30 years ago, when I headed the Santa Cruz AIDS Project, there was a needle exchange program that was going on at the time. And people were breaking the law to do it, volunteers in Santa Cruz County. And when they did it, they would actually find people that they earned a measure of trust with to be able to get them to go into treatment. At the time, that was the number one avenue into treatment in our county for people that were engaged in drug abuse. And yet, the window would open, it would be there for a little bit of time, and quite frequently there would just be no beds available, and people would just change their mind and continue to go to using. This would try to address that issue. Secondly, there's the bond, or the millionaire's tax was adopted in 2004. It was the priority was set by then Assembly member Darrell Steinberg, who sponsored the ballot measure, and it did a tax on millionaires, and it went to mental health services in California. What this would do is reprioritize some of that money to housing. And right now, I think it's 95% local, 5% state, and this would go 90 to 10. And it would prioritize so that money there would come for housing. And the real reason for this, and it's interesting because now Sacramento Mayor Darrell Steinberg, the legislator that promulgated that 20 years ago, has realized that's missing. And so he is supportive of prioritizing the money that was in that existing bond. And the state is short 8,000 psychiatric beds, according to a recent study by the Rand Corporation. And it's also had trouble reversing course on homelessness. And particularly some people are homeless for a dual diagnosis, mental health because of drug abuse. And this would help address residential facilities for people that have those issues. It's the only statewide measure on the ballot. And that's exactly what Governor Newsom really wanted, so that he could prioritize this. And the legislature, together with him, cleared the ballot of any competing bond measures, and of 3 constitutional amendments, which had been put off to the November 5th general election. The new bond measure really then is the new amount of $6.4 billion and the reprioritization of existing money that is within the millionaire's tax. It has no new money except the amount, which is roughly $300 million a year, that would be used to pay off the bond over, I believe it's 30 years. And usually the state's ethic is debt should never exceed between 5 to 6% of the state general fund, and this would be within that measure. Right now, all the money has been raised in favor of this measure. Governor Newsom has a ballot committee that has over $14 million in it. The California Medical Association has a ballot committee that has almost $500,000 in it. There's been no money reported by an opposing committee. This bill overwhelmingly passed the legislature. It was 40-0 in the Senate, so every Democrat and every Republican voted for it. In the Assembly, it was 68-42. And so Governor Newsom is all in. I know Senator Shannon Grove, who's a conservative Republican from Bakersfield, just wrote an op-ed. And among the supporters are NAMI, I believe it's the National Alliance related to mental health, the Labor Federation, California Teachers, SEIU, Business Roundtable, California Chamber of Commerce, California Labor Federation, California Hospital Association, California Medical Association, the National Alliance on Mental Illness in California, well, that's NAMI again, and the Steinberg Institute. Opposed is the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. Now, even though he voted to put it on the ballot, Senator Brian Jones, the Republican leader in the state Senate, the Californians against Proposition 1 and the Disability Rights Coalition of California are against. And the League of Women Voters is against. And the League of Women Voters basically says that the additional housing units do not outweigh the flaws, which is to redirect the money, and budgetary decisions should be made by the legislature and not by earmarking funds. There's also the Mental Health America of California opposes this measure. And the reason there's any opposition at all from any mental health interest is that in the reallocation of the Mental Health Services Act from 2004, the millionaire's tax, creates a few losers. So ongoing services now would be cut back to move to housing. And so the organizations that represent those services that would be cut back, and it's about 5% of the total amount, are opposing the measure because they would lose money. And newspapers have weighed in. So the LA Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Diego Union Tribune are urging a yes vote. And the Orange County Register is urging a no vote. So that's what this ballot measure is. That's what it does. Since I happen to be recording this in a place where I should be nonpartisan, but I do have free speech rights. So I should just say that I personally have endorsed this measure. And it's up to you to go to the polls based on this and cast your best vote. Then the other thing I was asked to talk about was to give an update on the state budget. And as you have read, there is a significant deficit in the budget in the fiscal year that we are heading into. The reason is California's flawed revenue system. 80 to 85% of the revenue in the state budget comes from either personal income tax or sales tax. They fluctuate wildly regardless all the time of where the economy is. And if the 50 taxpayers that are at the highest levels in the state don't do well, it affects the budget dramatically. And 2 years ago, when there was a big surplus, it was because there were stock offerings where people made an amazing amount of money and paid taxes. There have not been those stock offerings in this budget year, and it has really led to a wild swing. I'm not staying for questions because I'm recording this, but usually a question is, well, what would we do about that if we wanted to change that? The trouble is that if you lower the tax rate on the upper income and raise it among middle income people, then while that provides the stability and the volatility, it's really in many ways a politically difficult or impossible thing to do. But the sales tax used to be 2/3 or more of the budget, in some cases 80%, decades and decades ago, because we were in a manufacturing economy and people were buying products and paying sales tax. Now the economy has shifted to mostly or substantially a service economy, and services are not taxed. So if there was a decision to tax services and then not raise the sales tax but spread it around, wealthier people are the ones that disproportionately buy services. And so if you could find a way to adjust the income tax to equal the changes between wealthy and non-wealthy people in the sales tax, moving it to services, you might actually have a political solution that would work. You usually have to do that when the economic sun is shining, and that's not what's happening right now. So we have this budget where there's an argument between the legislative analyst, which is the budget and analytical office that staffs the legislature, and the governor, who's staffed by the Department of Finance. The legislative analyst says there is a $58 billion deficit. The governor says there is a $38 billion deficit. The difference in many ways is involved with school funding, but this is on a budget that is over $220 billion. So if the legislative analyst's estimate is right, it is a 25% deficit right now in California. And so this means that we're going to have to do some dramatic, tough things in the budget. So when the governor proposed a budget that was expecting a deficit of $38 billion, to be honest, it is not a real budget, because he did $38 billion deficit, dipping into reserves, deferring a lot of payments into the future, some borrowing, and only $8 billion of cuts. So with a $38 billion problem, only $8 billion of cuts. And part of the problem is there's a deficit projected for next year and the year after, or they're 2 years after the budget year. And if you don't make some cuts to lower the deficit in those years, you're going to be back right where you are now when it gets there. And so, and we also had this problem in last year for the storms. The income tax deadline was delayed 4 or 5 months. So the governor and the legislature had to adopt a budget not knowing what the revenues would really be. We looked at the economy and we did the best guess of what the revenues would be. Well, it turned out to be really off by the time the taxes came in. And so this particularly is a problem because we're in the middle of the year and people are already spending at a level that was predicated on revenue that isn't there. And so what the governor did in what I refer to as a not real budget is we, by the way, this is totally different than the time in the Great Recession where there was a huge budget deficit because there were zero reserves, zero. So Governor Brown, with legislative support, did the Rainy Day Fund in 2014, and we now have $40 billion of reserves. In the ideal world, you would parcel this out over 3 years if you're dipping into it, so that you don't dip totally into it this year, have the deficit next year, and have no cushion in any way. And if you're going to dip into the reserves, you should make some cuts so that you can fill behind it a little bit and it deals with the deficit as it would be in the future years. The governor's proposed a number of gimmicks. One of them is my favorite gimmick to explain to people because it's awful, and that is there's 12 payrolls in a fiscal year, and the last one's on June 30th. The governor proposes making the 12th payroll payment on July 1st so that you benefit by $3.1 billion in this budget by moving that off. But Schwarzenegger did that when he was governor, and it took Jerry Brown to put a few $1 billion in and buy it back near the end of his term. Now we would go back to doing that, and some future legislature and governor would have to appropriate $3 billion to try to move the payroll from July 1st to June 30th so that you are back on an uprighted position. The other thing that is interesting about this has to do with schools. I chair the Education Budget Subcommittee, and Proposition 98 does a minimum for schools every year based on revenues and taxes. What happened when the revenues came in dramatically lower is that for a year that is already done, it turns out the revenue was $8 billion less for schools. And yet that $8 billion had been built into the guarantee, and schools are spending it in the current year. And the governor made a decision to not recognize that $8 billion in Proposition 98, so you lower the guarantee to where the actual revenues are, to declare that $8 billion is from the general fund, not from schools funding, to have the schools not give it back. And normally, the schools would have what's known as a deficit factor, and in a future year, they would have to pay back the $8 billion in less money to them. Instead, the governor proposes that starting in the year he term limits out, in 2026, the general fund, not schools, will pay back the money, the $8 billion over 3 years. And his hope is the budget comes back and that will not be a profound effect. But it could have the impact of childcare, health services, firefighting, and those issues taking a cut to pay back to schools, rather than this be within the school's education budget. In an ideal world, we wouldn't approve that. But we would have to come up in the governor's budget with $8 billion to buy that out at a time when the deficit might be higher and we might be having to make painful cuts otherwise. So that gives you a flavor for how hard the decisions are going to be this year. And in the real world, if any of you depend on the state budget in any way, it's quite likely that there's going to have to be some form of reduction in every program to be able to try to get through. And this is difficult because we do safety net services in health and social services. We do higher education. We do student aid for higher education. We do firefighting. All these things are things that are the only places that you can look if you're really going to look for some cuts in the budget. And in the ideal world, what we would do is spend down the revenues over 3 years, make some cuts, and try to triage so that we're not making significant cuts in services. And then there's some nuances. For example, the state's reproductive health program gets, for every dollar the state spends, it gets $9 of federal money. So if you said, I want an equal across the board cut, everything gets cut by 10%, then actually in reproductive health services, you'd be cutting at 30 or 40% or more because you're really kissing off a lot of federal revenue. So the real thing is try to maintain a program like that and make the reductions where revenue isn't drawn down. So that is the reason why we're really going to rely on the budget staff. We're going to try to set the priorities. We're going to try to get real. And we will have hearings where we'll talk about this, and then the governor will look at the actual revenues and then propose a budget in May, and that's when we'll do the real work. We'll know what the revenues are. We'll know what we have to do. In May and June, we will make the final budget and get there. So I'm anxious to hear from any of you that have concerns. I think lobbying, just don't cut us or don't cut this, is probably not a realistic position in this year. So the real thing is, how can we best maintain what's most important to you? So that's the 20-minute summary of the state budget and of Proposition 1. I really look forward to seeing all of you in person soon. And thanks for letting me record this in lieu of being with you tonight. Best wishes for a successful rest of meeting. And I'll see you all soon.